The holidays are a time of cheer and merriment, big smiles, happiness everywhere you go. Well, not really. That's kind of the ideal situation. But tonight's story is about the less ideal situation. It's about people, good or bad, who spend their Christmas in the psych ward.
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hey, my spookies. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means. It's time for a little spooky in your weekly. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and we have quite the chilling one for you this week. But before we get to that, I need to give you a very merry thank you for listening to our program. I hope you're subscribed on your favorite podcasting app, because we're going to be releasing tons and tons of content all the way up to Christmas Day, and we would love to have you along for the scary ride. And while you're at it, after you've subscribed, why not leave us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts? It makes a huge difference in our show, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Good ratings cause new listeners to take a chance on our program. And speaking of our listeners, if you're craving a place to hang out with other spookies like yourself, well, we have a place just like that. It's called the Weekly Spooky Tomb of Terror over on Facebook. Just punch that into the search bar, and you can hang out with over 250 other spookies, including myself and many of our authors, as we hang out, share memes, talk about scary things, and so much more. It's a lot of fun, and we'd love to have you there. It doesn't cost a penny. It's just a fun place to hang out and celebrate the spookier side of life. And I want to mention that tomorrow we have a special episode where Cameron Chaney from Library Macabre will be joining me to talk about must-read books for the holiday horror season. So make sure you tune into that tomorrow. But now, my spookies, all that's left is to say go to weeklyspooky.com for anything and everything you need. And if you love what we're doing, join our Patreon and get exclusive stories every other week. But now, the wind is blowing, the chill is truly in the air. It's time for the story after these quick words from our sponsors. Xmas at the Psych Ward by Bruce Haney. It was snowing that Christmas Eve, but this didn't bring joy to Caleb because he had been sitting in the psych ward for the last couple of weeks after a failed suicide attempt. He had expected to see his parents that night, but the recent snowstorm had kept them away. He had been surprised that the facility did celebrate the holidays. There was a tree decorated in the common area, as well as other non-Christian themed holiday decorations. There were even gifts that had been delivered a few days earlier for the guests who were stuck there with no family visiting them. Guests is the term this particular hospital likes to use to refer to their patients. Being a guest was supposed to indicate that you were there temporarily. This was true for most, but not for all the people at Sumter Behavioral Health Center. Caleb was scheduled to be released in a few days, but he wasn't planning on making it through the night. He had pleaded his case to be let out before Christmas. He didn't want to end his life in a hospital. "I'm not like the other crazy people in here. I'm normal," he had pleaded. The term crazy is not accepted around here, and I am pressed to remind you that attempting to take one's life is not the act of a normal mind. His psychiatrist had responded. "It is when you've had the year that I have," Caleb told her. Caleb had always been a bit dramatic, but he was not exaggerating. His year had been truly awful. The first bad thing to happen was that he lost what he considered to be the love of his life. His name was Kyle, and he was a bit out of Caleb's league. While Caleb worked part-time at a failing video game store, Kyle was moving up the ranks at his job and heading toward management. Kyle was also a real looker. Caleb wasn't a slob or ugly, but he was nowhere near as attractive as Kyle. This difference in prospects and his low self-esteem made Caleb resent Kyle, and this resentment led to negativity and jealousy, which created a wedge in their friendship. A wedge that was just big enough for a man named Jacob to squeeze into. Caleb understood this in a way that only a person with poor self-esteem can. Jacob was a 10 and owned a condo before the age of 30. "Of course I couldn't compete with that. Who could?" Caleb had told his friend Sarah over coffee. "You'll find someone else," she said, trying to console him. "Sure, but he was the one. He was the love of my life, and I'll never, ever be that happy again," Caleb whined. It was hard for Sarah to not roll her eyes at him. Sarah was a little older than he was and a bit wiser. "It's going to be hard," she said. "There will be other guys out there. Not like Kyle, but think of it this way. You could get to fall in love again." "How exciting is that?" Sarah finished. "I don't want to," Caleb told her. "Of course you do. You've always been a romantic. You're going to have more first dates. You get to experience that awkward moment of holding hands for the first time, kisses goodnight, and strange bedfellows," she told him and gave him an exaggerated wink. "Are you talking about my prospects or yours?" Caleb asked, then laughed. Sarah could always make him feel better. They had been best friends since he was a junior and she was a sophomore. Her death 2 months later by a drunk driver was harder on him than losing Kyle. Those events happened before summer, and by the time Christmas came around, he had lost his job, had his car stolen, and totaled by his insurance company. Not because it was wrecked, but because 2 people were found smoking meth and fentanyl inside of it. He didn't have full coverage, so he was out of a vehicle. To cap it off, like a lyric from a sad country song, even his damn dog ran away. The one Kyle had brought home for their 2nd anniversary. Even before this awful year, Caleb had been depressed. He was a cutter, but still, everyone was shocked when he tried to take his life by slashing his wrists. At the health center, he didn't have access to razor blades, so he was going to make a noose out of the sheet from his bed. Before attempting to take his life, he decided to see what the other guests were doing in the common room. This decision to be social possibly saved his unwanted life. Less than an hour later, the killings would begin. Some of the other guests suffered from depression like Caleb, and some others had other mental challenges that they were going through. But one guest, unbeknownst to the others, was a full-blown homicidal maniac. It was getting late, but a couple of other guests were sitting in the common room watching an old black-and-white Christmas movie. "Hey, Caleb," John said passively. Caleb liked him okay enough as long as John didn't start talking about politics. "Merry Christmas, Caleb," Ethan said to him. Caleb thought Ethan was a good kid. Sadly, he too was a cutter, and a failed suicide attempt is what landed him in the hospital as well. Though Ethan did admit in group that he didn't want to die. I I don't know. I couldn't stand it. I was so invisible to them. I thought if I died, they would care. They couldn't ignore me if they were planning my funeral, Ethan was saying, but was interrupted by, "You pussy," another guest named Tim had said, and then laughed. John had been there too, and laughed. Caleb felt for the kid, and that was why he kicked Tim's chair over, which also didn't help his case for being released before Christmas. When Tim fell to the ground, Mark, another patient who never spoke, started laughing and continued to do so while Tim and Caleb were separated and escorted out. This annoyed Tim, and he screamed at him, "Shut the fuck up, Mark!" Mark continued to laugh to the point that everyone felt unnerved by it. He was laughing because he knew when he started his massacre, Tim would be first. "Merry Christmas, Ethan. How are you doing tonight?" Caleb asked before sitting down in the common area. "I'm doing okay. I wish I was at home. This would have been my last Christmas to spend living at my parents' house," Ethan said. "Yeah? Where do you expect to be next year?" Caleb asked. "University of Oregon," Ethan said. "You're going to college?" Caleb asked. "Well, my parents are paying for it, and I have the grades, and since the whole killing myself thing didn't work out, I should build myself a future," Ethan told Caleb. "You are much smarter at your age than I was, or am now. If I thought like you, I might not be spending my Christmas here with the likes of you two. No offense," Caleb said, and then laughed. John and Ethan laughed too. During their conversation, a nurse named Rob walked into the room. They thought they were going to be told to get to their own rooms, but he made a note of how many guests were in the common area. A few minutes later, Rob walked in with a tray with 4 mugs. "The usual suspects," he said while he handed them each a cup of hot chocolate. The 3 looked up at him with a questioning look. "Merry Christmas. I wanted to do something nice. It's Christmas Eve after all. Some of you guests don't deserve a treat. Some of you are a pain in my ass," Rob said, and then took a drink from his cup. "John, you borderline don't deserve a treat, but you're with good company, so you can reap their reward. It is Christmas and all," Rob said. "It's just hot chocolate. You're not sucking our dicks. Don't feel so high and mighty giving us a 50-cent cup of cocoa," John said. "I can take it back," Rob said calmly, not letting John get to him. No, sorry. Thank you. Merry Christmas," John said. They all sat quietly after that, drinking their hot chocolate and watching the old Christmas movie. Then they heard the screaming.
More scares to come. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
Rob was the first up, and the first to run down the hall to find out what was going on. Billy, the other nighttime nurse, came out from the office and beat him to the room. Inside was an older gentleman named Ed, who had been in and out of places like this his whole life. He had a bit of a violent past, always attacking the people close to him, but never enough to do actual jail time. Ed was screaming because his roommate, Tim, was lying in his bed, with his throat slit and his face slashed all up. Rob was the senior nurse there and quickly took charge of the situation. "What happened here? Who did this?" Rob asked. "I don't know. He was like this when I came back from the bathroom," Ed said. "John, Caleb, Ethan, back to your rooms. Caleb, take Ed with you, and none of you let anyone except for the 2 of us in. Billy, go back to the office and call 911. I'll look for the killer," Rob ordered. "What if he tries to attack you?" Billy asked. "I've been taking self-defense classes for years. Do you think I would work here around these crazies without some way of protecting myself?" Rob asked. "Right," Billy said. "You haven't been taking classes like I told you, have you?" Rob asked. "Well, Billy stammered. "You fucking rookie. Just get to the damn phone, Billy," Rob shouted. Billy ran off and John, Ethan, Ed, and Caleb stared at Rob. "Get to your rooms, now," Rob said. They all turned and left. Rob yelled after them, "Sorry for saying crazies. Don't tell my boss, please." Rob then went on down the hall to look for signs of the killer. John went to his room. The doors could only be locked with a key, so he decided that he would push his bed up against the door. He didn't know that the killer was hiding under his bed, and as soon as he got close enough, he heard snickering. And then, before he could react, a hand with a stolen kitchen knife stabbed through his left shoe. The cheap hospital-issued shoes did nothing to hinder the blade, though it did keep his now severed middle two toes close to where they had once belonged. John then fell to the floor, and the killer took the opportunity to slash his throat. As the blood sprayed, Mark laughed harder and harder. Billy heard the laughter, but before he could make it out of his office, the killer was there. "Happy holidays," Mark said. Once Billy was taken care of, Mark went to the next phase of his plan. He knew that the landline phone was dead. He had severed it hours ago. He knew which line it was because he had severed it months earlier when he first came up with the plan. Everyone had made a big stink about it. A technician had to come out and fix it, and they lost dessert for 2 days since no one would admit to cutting the line. Once in the office, the killer found what he hoped he would find in there. Both nurses' cell phones, charging. He had made a mental note after weeks of watching their patterns that it was around this time each night that they plugged their phones in to charge after a shift's worth of TikTok watching and Instagramming. He acted quickly and methodically. He took each phone and shoved his knife through the screens. He then took the useless landline phone and smashed it against the server equipment that provided internet to the building. With that done, he looked around the room for other opportunities to add to his chaos. He didn't find much, but hanging on the coat rack, he saw something that he hoped he would find. He laughed the whole time as he grabbed the Santa Claus costume off the rack and put it on. The plan was going better than he had imagined. Luck was on his side. Caleb had dragged Ethan and Ed to his room. Caleb's roommate was sitting up in bed. "What the fuck is going on out here?" Steve yelled. Steve was at the health center because he attempted to light his former workplace on fire because he didn't receive a Christmas bonus. He didn't quite understand that former employees don't typically get Christmas bonuses. Steve was a bit of a hothead and was fired after he threw his boss's world's best boss mug at his own boss's head. "People are getting killed, Steve. That is what the fuck is going on," Caleb explained. "For real?" Steve asked Ed. Ed was older and Steve trusted him. Ed shook his head up and down. This calmed Steve down. "Who?" Steve asked. "Tim, at least. His throat was slashed," Ed said. "I've heard 2 other screams since. I think possibly Billy too," Caleb added. "Fuck. Tim got out in a couple of days, not that he wanted to. Billy was kind of a prick though," Steve finished. "Don't speak ill of the dead," Ethan whispered. "Is Rob okay?" Steve asked. Rob was a good guy. He had to make everyone follow the rules, but he did it in a respectful way, and he was respected for it. "As far as we know," Caleb said. At that moment, Rob had returned to the main corridor, not finding any signs of the killer. Rob wished there was more staff there. Billy and himself were it. Usually there were another 2, but the holidays were always light. The staff wanted to be home with their families, and each year many guests were released early to make that possible. As soon as Rob made it back to the guest wing, he heard the laughter. And then, the killer, in the stolen Santa Claus outfit, stepped out of the office. "What are you doing?" Rob asked. The killer just laughed. Are you wearing my Santa Claus outfit?" Rob asked. For the last 4 years, Rob had worn that costume every Christmas morning at the facility. Every year, the guests would make fun of him for it. But he could tell from some that they did appreciate the effort. The killer didn't respond to his first question, so he asked another. "What's going on in here?" Rob asked. No response. "Did you kill Tim?" Rob asked. The killer shook his head, yes, then made a cross with his 2 index fingers. Rob was confused until the killer then held up 2 fingers. "You killed 2 others?" Rob asked. The killer laughed, then decided to sprint towards Rob while pulling out the knife that he had tucked into the waistband of the Santa suit. "Get away from me!" Rob yelled. Back in Caleb's room, they had been listening to the exchange, and when they heard the killer go after Rob, without even thinking, Ethan pushed open the door. Caleb followed, stopping just long enough to grab a chair. Without knowing it, they were directly in the killer's path, who immediately adjusted his aim and went to stab Ethan. Caleb pushed Ethan out of the way. Ethan fell to the floor and rolled away unscathed. Caleb wasn't as lucky. The killer slashed the knife at him, cutting his wrist. Caleb watched as the blood from his arm hit the polished floor, and for a moment was taken back to a few weeks ago, when he was the one spilling his blood. It was a weird sensation. Caleb didn't feel scared. He felt violated. Cutting his wrist was something he did, not something that was done to him. Caleb was filled with anger and swung the chair at the pseudo-Santa as hard as he could. Then again, the killer held his arms up to protect himself from the blows, and then ran away. Once the killer was gone, Caleb looked over to Rob. "You okay?" he asked. Rob and Ethan looked him up and down. He was bleeding heavily, and they just witnessed him going primal while beating on the killer. "Are you okay?" Rob asked. "I'm fine," Caleb said while taking his hand and rubbing his hair back. Blood dripped onto his face. Caleb then held out his arm and looked at the cut again. "Maybe not," Caleb said. Rob ran off and moments later was back with a full first aid kit. If you're going to get attacked, let it be in a hospital-type situation. Their first aid kits are usually well stocked. A moment after Rob finished fixing him up, the lights went out. "He must have gotten to the breaker box," Rob said cheerfully. "Why is that good?" Ethan asked. "The box is located in the stairwell at the end of the west hallway," Rob said while he got up and started walking. "And?" Caleb asked. "He's far enough away that it should be safe to go to my office and grab a flashlight and call the police, if Billy hasn't already," Rob said. In the office, the 3 of them felt around for anything that could be a weapon. Rob eventually found a flashlight in a drawer. When he turned it on, it revealed that the stuff they were walking in was blood. The flashlight also helped them see where the blood had come from. Some was from Billy's lifeless body, while the rest came from Billy's head, which had been cut off and thrown onto the desk with little to no regard.
You're not safe yet. Weekly Spooky will be right back.
With the flashlight, it was also easy to find the useless phone. Rob then went for his own, which he found next to Billy's. Both destroyed. Okay, don't panic, Rob said to himself. If we can get to the breaker and turn it back on, We can use a computer to reach out to the police. There has to be a way to do that, right? Rob asked the two. Caleb frowned and pointed to the modem and the internet equipment that had been destroyed. What are we going to do? Ethan asked. I don't know. We could try to grab the others and then run outside, but we're 2 miles from anything and it's snowing pretty heavily outside, Rob said. Maybe we could just hide, Ethan suggested. Or we could all come out into the open, Caleb said. You think? Rob asked. I think our strength is in our numbers, which we won't have if we don't act quickly. It's easy for him to take us out one by one, but when he attacked and there were 3 of us there, we walked away. Scathed, but we did walk away, Caleb explained. The 3 of them walked back to Caleb's room to grab Steve and Ed. You have to come with us, Caleb told them. I ain't going nowhere. We're safe in this room, Ed said. Do you think so? How do you think Tim was killed? In one of these rooms. We need to band together, and we need a spot where we have room to fight, Caleb explained. Caleb was persuasive, and as a group, they went to each room looking for other survivors. They found John's dead body in one room. They found 2 other dead guests, each with a pillow over their head, so they couldn't scream. He was going room to room, Rob said. Maybe he's back in one, snuck back to them when we were in the office, and now he's just waiting to jump out and stab one of us in the throat, Ed said. So we stay away from the rooms, Ethan said. No, Caleb replied. Then what? Ed asked. We lock them, Rob explained, understanding what Caleb was getting at. Every one of them, Caleb finished. They went methodically down the corridor, locking the doors with Rob's keys. After each door was locked, one of them would put their ear and listen for any sign of life. Nothing was heard until they locked the second-to-last door. Ethan then put his ear to the door and heard a noise inside that he couldn't make out. Someone's in this room, Ethan whispered to the rest of them. Whose room is that? Steve asked. It's been empty. Has been for a week, Rob said. Then it has to be the killer, Caleb replied. Let's get him then, Ed said. It's safer to just lock him up. There's no exit from that room, Rob explained. Then, the last door that they were about to check flung open. Ed was the closest to the door, so he was the one to be stabbed by the killer in the Santa Claus suit. To the common room, Rob yelled. When the killer pulled out his knife, Caleb grabbed Ed and dragged him. Ed was screaming, Don't leave me! The killer followed and continued to stab poor Ed with every step they made. Eventually, Ed's body went limp, and there was nothing for Caleb to do but drop it. The killer then swung his knife at Caleb, just barely missing his throat. Why are you doing this? Caleb yelled. The killer laughed. Mark? Caleb asked. The killer swung his knife at Caleb again. He had to run to the common room after that, and by the time he got there, the others had gathered what weapons they could find, which wasn't very much. Ethan was smart and grabbed the nutcracker that was out as a Christmas decoration. Rob was practical and grabbed a chair, while Steve yielded the heaviest Christmas package he could find under the tree, which wasn't all that heavy. To get away from the attack, Caleb ran behind the tree. Rob swung the chair, which the killer grabbed with his free hand. Rob looked at the killer, shocked that his knife-wielding Santa Claus was able to stop the chair's momentum with only one hand. Rob thought that's not just strength. That is the power of being truly crazy. The killer then put the knife in his pocket and grabbed the chair with his other hand and made moves to fling Rob. Steve made his way over to hit the killer Santa with the package, but this had little effect. Ethan had better luck, smacking him on the shoulder with the heavy wood nutcracker. The killer screamed out in pain and dropped his hold on the chair. While this was going on, Caleb was trying to figure out what he could do to help the situation. And finally, he found his weapon of choice. It was unconventional, to say the least. Caleb grabbed the wreath that hung on the wall and waited for an opportunity, which came suddenly after Ethan hit the killer another time in the head. The killer responded by pulling his knife back out and slashing Ethan across the chest. He then turned around and ran. Caleb was furious as he thought about the future that young Ethan could have once he was out of there. Caleb ran after him and put the wreath over the killer's head, and then used it to swing him into the wall, repeatedly. During the struggle, the killer stabbed Caleb in the thigh, but Caleb hardly noticed. Eventually, the killer went limp from his head, repeatedly hitting the wall. Caleb then grabbed the knife from the killer's lifeless body. He was still furious and made moves to turn the killer over to slash his throat. Rob was taking care of Ethan's wounds during this, and Steve walked over to watch. But Caleb was no killer and had a change of heart. "I can't do it," Caleb said. And then he stood up to check on Ethan. "He's gonna make it. He just barely nicked him," Rob told him. "Give me your keys," Caleb said. Rob unhooked them from the loop on his pants and threw them to Caleb. "I think he's dead, but just in case we should lock him up," Caleb explained to Steve. Steve and Caleb then each grabbed a side of the wreath that was around his neck and dragged him to the room where they had heard the sound. Caleb handed the keys over to Steve to unlock it, and Caleb held the knife out, just in case. When they opened the door, they heard what had been making the sound inside. The music came from a radio. Caleb and Steve laughed, then dragged the killer into the room. Momentarily, they were distracted as the song faded down and the radio DJ came on. "Well, here we are. It's 12:01 and it's officially Christmas. Merry Christmas to all of you KWHG listeners. Hope you were good and didn't make it onto Santa's naughty list. This is your pal, Big Bobby, and the Christmas classics are going to keep on a-coming. Here's Deck the Halls," he said. And the song began. That was the moment that the killer tried to leap up and grab the knife back from Caleb. Without thinking, Caleb stabbed him in the throat. The killer stared at him, with hatred in his eyes. Caleb then twisted the blade, and a moment later, all life left the killer. Steve reached down and pulled off the beard and hat to reveal what Caleb had already figured out. It was Mark, who would never laugh his crazy laugh again. With that done, Caleb got up, walked over to the radio, and turned up the volume. As they walked back to Ethan and Rob, the song continued. During the struggle of the night, Caleb couldn't wait for it to be over, for everybody to be safe, so he could go back to his room and kill himself. And now that he had the killer's knife, he was more prepared than before. He was originally going to hang himself with his sheet, but now that it was over, he just wanted to check on his friends. He had seen enough death. It had been a terrible year, but fighting for his and other people's lives made Caleb finally see value in life. So, he let go of the knife, and it fell to the floor. I love a happy ending. Well, happy enough. Big thanks to Bruce Haney for sending in that story. It really was a great one, and we have more from him coming soon. Very, very soon. And don't worry, there's plenty more holiday horror coming all the way up until Christmas Day. So make sure you're subscribed to Weekly Spooky, your holiday horror source. And if you love what we're doing here, I want to remind you, there's an exclusive Strickfield series being published on Patreon right now called The Weekend. Every other week, we publish a brand new episode of this 12-part series only on Patreon. To hear those episodes, all you have to do is go to weeklyspooky.com and click on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get a story every other week and our undead gratitude. We really do appreciate the support we have over at Patreon. We have over 91 backers right now, and I would love so much to make it to 100. So why not make the move today at weeklyspooky.com and click on Patreon. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names on the show. And they are Johnny Nix, John Callan, Bobbletopia.com, Megan Hua, Julia Kirsch, Brent McCullough, Steve King, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much for helping me bring the spooky on the weekly. And if you want to join them, just go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and choose any level of support over $15 a month. You'll hear your name at the end of every show from my silky smooth voice. But now, my friends, it's time for me to get back to work. There's so many more scares, as we're about 11 days away from Cryptmas. So for myself, for my producer Dan Wilder, my executive producer Rob Fields, and my composer Ray Mattis, I will talk at you very, very soon.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.